Hej och välkomna till Expressens scen. Under den här veckan så har vi också haft ett samarbete med CNN som vi har ett nära samarbete med, och en del i det är att ledande nyhetsankare från CNN kommer hit till oss. Isa Suarez har varit här tidigare och nu har vi här också Max Foster. And I'm going to switch to English now.
Great, suits me.
Okay. Very welcome to Almedalen.
It's great to be here.
This is not your first time in Almedalen, right?
No, I've been here twice before, I think. Yes, twice. It's brilliant. It's always good weather. I think I'm a good omen. It's always sunny when I'm here, and apparently it's not always sunny.
Almost all the time. So what do you make out of this? You see leading politicians walking around the streets of Visby.
Yeah. Well, I think that's amazing, and I've said before that you can't imagine this happening anywhere else, really, apart from Scandinavia, but particularly Sweden. But it is interesting that there's more security this year. I mean, this wouldn't happen elsewhere because there would be concerns about ministers walking past members of the public who haven't been checked. And it's interesting to see a bit more security this year, which is a bit of a shame because it takes away a bit of what Almedalen's about, but I can understand why they're doing it, and I'm surprised it's been able to last this long without that level of security, really.
Yeah. And of course, the terrorist attack in Stockholm is on everybody's mind. You were here covering that as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, it was horrific. I was here for the weekend, and then I went back to London. And I mean, what was really sort of disheartening about it was I've covered so many of these now, where they've taken a vehicle and driven into a crowd. The ones in London, the one in Nice in France, and Berlin as well. And there's a similar pattern to them, and it's starting to feel as if it's almost normal, which is what was interesting. I interviewed your foreign minister at the time saying, should we just get used to this? And she was actually very strong on saying, no, we shouldn't get used to this. It should always be shocking, and we should always try to fight it. And I think that's a really interesting message, because I think in many other countries around Europe, they do sort of, the message really is, you've got to get used to this sort of thing now. It's going to keep happening. You need to be more aware of it, and it could happen to you at any point. And there's a big debate really about that, do we normalize it? And also, how much do we cover these events? How do we separate different terror attacks? There's a big orchestrated attack like the ones on Paris, on the sort of the lone wolves they call them, but they're not always recruited by ISIS. They just decide to go with ISIS at the last minute to save themselves. And perhaps, that's not as big a story as it, as we sometimes say it is. Or perhaps we should not be following those stories for as long. I mean, they're always going to be shocking. We're always going to cover them. But I think there's a question about how long we cover those when they haven't been directed by a terror group.
Do you believe we are overplaying it?
I don't think we have really so far, to be honest. But I do think we need to start asking ourselves, how long we run with these stories. Because how much can we learn from them when quite often these people haven't had much association with terror groups. They've just attached themselves at the last minute. So that becomes more of a social policy question and how to cope with people who are dropping out of society.
Terrorism is a trending topic during Almedalsveckan. Another one is fake news. And at CNN, you know something about that, right?
Well, we've been accused of it by the President of the United States, which is extraordinary, isn't it?
How does that feel?
To be honest with you, I don't find it funny. Some people laugh about it. I think it's really depressing, actually, because it hasn't changed at all how I've worked. I don't think we've ever been anything. I mean, we are news. Then you have to ask the question about what is fake news. Fake news is made-up news, and the one thing I'll say about CNN is it's all about accuracy and getting things right. And if there's one thing bosses pass down to us, it's that accuracy is everything. Our brand is everything. Particularly in the world of social media, we have to be right on everything, because there are lots of other news organizations out there now, and we need to be the ones that people come to as an authoritative source. So we have to be accurate. So that's all we think about. So it's not, in no way is any of it fake. So then you have to look at the motivations as to why we're being called fake news. And I think that's a much bigger debate, but that's something that Donald Trump needs to explain.
Has this actually spurred you to do an even better job?
I think social media put a lot more pressure on us to, we've always had to be right. And I was, brought through the BBC, and it was exactly the same view. You have to be correct on everything. We have to, when we are wrong, and all news organizations make mistakes, we have to admit it very quickly indeed. I think that's the only difference. Just because people hear about mistakes more quickly, we need to sort of get on top of them more quickly and take control of them more quickly. But the reason I went into journalism is I like telling true stories. So it'd be a bit weird if I suddenly decided to start telling the truth.
So you're covering events all around the world, for sure, as an anchor and correspondent. But you're based in London, right?
Yeah.
How would you describe the media coverage of the referendum running up to the Brexit decision?
Well, I think it's fair to say that everyone was really surprised by the result. I remember being in Downing Street when David Cameron came out and resigned. And his wife's face was she was in utter shock. And I think that, for me, confirmed that he didn't expect it. But this whole idea of a liberal elite in London not being in touch with what's going on outside London, I think there was some truth to that, actually, because we were all really surprised. And there's a very large broadcaster in the United Kingdom, who I won't name, and I've got friends there who said that they had made no plans, actually, for a Brexit result. So everyone was surprised by it. And perhaps you can look back at the coverage and think, did that have an effect on how we covered it beforehand? I can't really think of any. Again, I think we reflected all views leading up to the election result. But, a bit like Trump, there was this hidden Brexit voter, like there was a hidden Trump voter that didn't come through the polls. And if we made a mistake, it was perhaps talking too much to the polls and putting too much emphasis on the polls because they were wrong. But in the UK, a year before, we'd had the general election, and the polls were completely wrong about that as well. So I think everyone needs to learn about polls. I mean, the polls need to get better, that's for sure. Because people like, a hardened Trump supporter isn't necessarily going to be taking part in these polls. And a Brexit supporter isn't necessarily going to admit, even if they did speak to a pollster. It's a different sort of politics now, and it's not party politics either, is it? It's what was very interesting about Brexit is that it split families and it split parties. And David Cameron tried to bring his party together by holding the referendum because he had this long-term issue between pro-Europeans, anti-Europeans, and all he did was made it worse because now you've got very clear, demarcated lines between Brexiteers and non-Brexiteers. And that's a real problem. So the Conservative Party split, and the election was called so Theresa May could have a mandate in Brexit negotiations, and she didn't, and she lost a lot of her mandate.
Since last time you were here, Swedish migration policies has made a U-turn, so to say. Migration is a big question around in the whole of Europe. What do you think about the media coverage of migration issues?
I think what I find a bit different, we do a lot of stories about refugees, and we're really committed to that story and going out to all of these countries where, we've got reporters in Erbil at the moment. We're covering, ready to go and cover Raqqa as closely as we can. And you see these horrific images of people pouring out of cities where they've lost everything. And people have become a bit desensitized to those images, I think. They're sort of used to seeing them, and they can't connect that with, accepting genuine refugees into Europe. So that's a bit depressing. But there's obviously an issue that people have with too many immigrants coming in, and certainly in the UK. I don't think that in the UK, maybe I'm wrong, but my impression has always been that there's not racism underlying that issue with immigration. It's about economics and people feeling as if they can't get jobs because people are from other parts of Europe largely are taking their jobs. And then that gets caught up with the whole refugee crisis. So I think, as journalists, we've got to separate all of those different elements, economic refugees and genuine refugees, and how to support them and how not to support them. I think liberal Europe, and Sweden's part of that, they'll always have a part of it that want to help people that are in trouble. It's just going through a tricky patch.
Soon we're going to end it, but one last question. I believe Almedalen is not the only reason why you come to Sweden. You have some Swedish connection, right?
Yes, my mother's from Säffle.
From Säffle?
Yes.
Okay.
And my uncle actually lives on Gotland.
He does?
Yes.
Okay.
So, I come back every so often.
Yeah. You're so welcome back to Säffle and to Gotland. Thank you very much
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Talking to you, Max Foster. Tack så mycket allihopa.